In 1597, when Hugh O'Neill was arresting most of the Crown's forces in the east of the country, Red Hugh O'Donnell was wreaking havoc in the west of Ireland. At the time, the town of Athenry would have been seen as a satellite of Crown rule in Ireland, and as such, it would have impeded Red Hugh O'Donnell and his confederates' political and military ambitions. The annals of the Four Masters tell us that Red Hugh O'Donnell's army crafted special siege ladders that were thrown up against these walls, and that fire and flame were set at the gates. And eventually, although there was some defence of the town by the warders, that the town fell, the parapets were taken, and O'Donnell's men leapt into the streets of Athenry, securing the streets and throwing the gates open for the rest of Red Hugh O'Donnell's forces to enter the town. What happened would have been a very harrowing sight for the inhabitants of the town. The storehouses and the great houses were looted and ransacked, and the annals of the Four Masters tell us specifically that copper, iron, textiles and foodstuffs were all taken. It would take many generations for the town of Athenry to recover. So let's take a closer look at some of the weapons that would have been employed by O'Donnell's army and by their foes at this time in the late 16th century. First up, the main weapon used would have been the caliver. The caliver was a short style of musket firearm, smooth bore. It would have used old style black powder that would have been quite noxious. The rate of fire with these guns was some 3 shots a minute, and the range effectively was somewhere between 60 and 80 meters. The powder was carried in special receptacles. One type of carrier would have been the portache, which would have carried a special flask or powder horn that had a special lever at the top here that was used to discharge the powder into the gun. And also in this portache you have a pouch that would have carried the musket balls. These musket balls were made of lead, small little balls that would have done massive damage upon entry and bigger damage in the exit wound. A lot of the fighting that happened in Athenry in 1597 would have involved close quarters, cold steel weapons. Let's have a close look and see what sort of weapons O'Donnell's forces would have been using. One fairly universal sidearm at the time was the skean. Skean was the traditional Irish fighting knife, and you can see here on the sheath here the traditional Gaelic knotwork of the native Irish of the time that was, blossoming still since the Gaelic resurgence of the previous century. The skean itself was a single-edged blade with a heavy back and an acute point. Unlike a sword, it didn't have a crossguard, it didn't have a pommel. Swords were also used. Late on in the 16th century, swords like the old style Irish Gaelic ring sword, one of the classic native weapons of Ireland, was probably slowly falling out of use. One of the reasons for this was because O'Neill and O'Donnell's war is on such a scale that productivity probably couldn't match demand at the time. Other traditional swords used by the Gael included the Scottish Claymore sword, the two-hander, in its traditional fringed scabbard here, with its distinctive quatrefoil terminals and sloping quillons running down towards the blade. However, even in these early days of the 9 Years' War, before it reached its peak at the Yellow Ford in 1598, O'Neill's forces are seen in picture maps, and O'Donnell's forces too, using swords like this, Continental Swords of the 16th century, with rings to protect the hand and complex guards. This one here, for example, is from Italy and wouldn't be dissimilar to swords that the Spanish were using at the time, O'Neill and O'Donnell's allies. Captured British swords, or English swords I should say, were also used. This one here is what we would call a basket hilt, giving excellent protection to the hand. So captured weapons like this would have been used to a great extent probably by O'Donnell's forces at Athenry in 1597. Now, along with the sword was used a targe, and the man bearing these weapons was called a targeteer. The traditional Irish shield or targe was made of 2 layers of wood. On the back, the deer hair was retained on the shield to add some padding to the shock effect of a blow coming in. The front of the shield was usually made of tooled deerskin or bovine leather. Sometimes, not always, there was a boss in the centre of the shield, and usually they were also decorated with brass tacks and carved decoration also. The typical diameter of these targes was about 19 inches. A slightly larger shield was also used by the Irish forces probably during this time, and that was a shield known as the target. The target was probably imported from Philip II's Spain at the time. A large spike in the centre could be used offensively, but of course its main purpose was defence. It was a heavier shield than the targe, so it wasn't as useful in an offensive manner, but gave excellent protection, as you can see. Now, body armour had generally fallen out of use in Northern Europe and generally in Europe at this time, but helmets were still universal, and the Irish at this time were no different to anybody else, including the English and the Spanish, who were also involved in these campaigns. There was no national helmets per se, but there was sometimes national trends. So for example, this here was a classic helmet known as the Spanish Marion. It was characterised by its high dome, a pear-stalk that went backwards from the helmet, from the brow, a deep brow to protect the shoulders, the back of the neck and the face. Here we have another style of Marion, sometimes called the English Marion, but more normally called the comb Marion because of its distinctive high comb on the top here. On this particular helmet you can also see a plume holder. So like the way a modern soldier might wear a stripe or another piece of insignia to indicate rank, sometimes rank was portrayed by a brightly coloured feather at the rear of the helmet held by this feather plume. Another type of helmet also used in contemporary Europe at this time was the capucette. The capucette appears to be the one that O'Donnell and O'Neill's forces preferred. In contemporary picture maps, and we're lucky to have quite a few of these drawn by English soldiers involved in these campaigns, we see the Irish soldiers wearing this helmet as their main type. The advantage of this one over the other two Marions was that it has a more shallow brim, which aided a gunman or a caliber man in aiming his weapon. Like all the helmets this period, often these helmets were either fire blacked from the forge, beeswaxed, or they were painted black to protect them from rusting to some degree. All the helmets also sported these lames or articulations on the sides of the face to protect the straps from being cut in a combat situation. The inside the helmet was padded not with the leather spider you might be used to seeing in World War II and World War I helmets, but rather a leather band that was stitched to pads of linen that were stuffed with wool. That's how we keep our comfort from the concussive effect of incomings at that time. So I hope that looking at these artefacts has given you some sort of insight, some sort of visual fix as to how things may have looked from a material culture point of view in Athenry way back on that fateful harrowing day in 1597.